you mentioned a minute ago how much fertilizer you waste based on where your pH is at. And this is going to vary for every soil nutrient, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, potassium, whatever. They're all a little bit different. But in general, if you have a soil pH of 4.5, you're wasting about 70% of your fertilizer.
Yep.
If your soil pH is 5.0, which is not uncommon in the deep south, you're wasting about 50% of your fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
Lime is the absolute cheapest soil amendment there is. Now, oftentimes you need to apply tons of it per acre, but it's still very cheap. So yeah, number one, a lot of times people will be like, oh, well, I can't do lime and fertilizer, so which one would I do? The best answer is do both of them. Soil amendments are not that expensive, especially relative to a poor productivity food plot when you don't amend your soil. But if I could only do one, I'm going to do lime.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Jacob Dykes.
And I'm Eric Mitchell, and we're the co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab.
As hunters, deer biologists, and wildlife professors, we're passionate about bridging the gap between research and management.
Each episode, we explore the latest deer research from around the country, breaking it down to discuss how it can improve wildlife and habitat management on your land.
Whether you're a hunter, a land steward, or simply interested in deer biology, Deer University is for you. Welcome back to Deer University. Eric, today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Jacob?
I'm good. I'm excited about this one. 'Tis the season. We're talking cool season food plots. And it's not just us two today.
No, it is not.
We are joined by what I would consider the workhorse of the MSU Deer Lab, Mr. Luke Resop. Luke, I know that you are extremely busy, so I appreciate you jumping on with us today.
Well, yeah, I'm glad to be here. I would oftentimes consider myself more of a donkey than a horse, but I appreciate it.
Well, I tell you what, I don't know anybody that works harder. And to be honest with you, I don't think any of our listeners are going to not know who you are. I mean, if you cover or keep up with the podcast, the socials, especially the YouTube, I mean, they're seeing you. You're putting out great content all the time. And we, of course, appreciate that. But for the one or two people that may be tuning in that don't know who you are, would you mind just giving a recap who you are, what you do, that kind of thing?
Sure. So my name is Luke Resop. I am originally from the Great North, not Mississippi. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and I've been slowly migrating my way further and further south over the years. I've been at the MSU Deer Lab since 2019 in some way or another. I am currently working on my PhD, focusing on food plots, conventional versus regenerative food plots, and we're also studying some old field management and how all of those different things influence deer and turkeys. My master's research was on prescribed fire, and so I'm a pyromaniac through and through. Really what my interests are is all things habitat management, plant communities, deer, turkey, just applied habitat management stuff. So I think we're going to, even though our focus today is going to be on food plots, we're going to find a way to throw in some prescribed fire and other habitat management stuff too. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, Luke, did you mention you're a pyromaniac? Did you?
I am a pyromaniac.
Say that a couple of times, maybe. No, and yeah, Luke mentioned being a PhD student. Also runs the social media account. One of the best extension professionals that I've ever seen, putting content out to landowners, hunters, that kind of thing. So yeah, glad to have you, man. We know you're busy putting out new content, getting ready for food plots, which we're talking about today. Like I said, 'tis the season. Let's get started. We're going to talk A to Z. Building a successful food plot. And that's what I like to refer to it as. But I think important thing that we need to preface here is that before we're talking food plots, what about habitat management?
Absolutely. Habitat management. We oftentimes refer to food plots. I mean, we should be referring to food plots as supplemental food plots and the emphasis on supplemental, right? So really you need to get your bearings underneath of you with habitat management first and really manage your expectations about what those food plots are going to supply.
Yeah. In the way that I always, when I'm working with landowners and stuff is you want to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to make sure that your property is reaching its potential from a habitat perspective, right? Like you want to, and habitat is 365 days a year. We like to think about it when we're sitting in a deer stand, but we're trying to make life easy for these critters. They got the food, the cover, and everything they need interspersed together to make life simple. And then we come in with cool season food plots, warm season food plots, that kind of thing.
Yeah. A couple points I would like to add to that, focusing on habitat management. One of the, I'd say, most infamous questions that people ask about food plots relative to habitat management and property management in general is, what percentage of my property should be planted in food plots? And I don't love that question because I think it is going to vary tremendously property to property, region to region, based on all sorts of different factors. But regardless of what that answer is, your food plot acreage is almost always going to be minimal relative to the rest of your property. It's going to be somewhere in the on the upper end, 10% range, maybe more. But either way, I mean, the vast majority of a property is going to be something other than food plot. So, food plots aren't taking up that much of a property, and there's a lot of a deer's life in terms of where they're avoiding predators, where they're thermoregulating, where they're hiding fawns, where they're, foraging on other things that aren't provided in food plots that they still need. Food plots are really just a very small part of the equation in terms of the habitat management picture and what they provide to deer. The other part about it that I always like to think about and consider is that a lot of the forage species that are present in a well-managed plant community, either in your woods or in your fields, are much more drought resistant than food plots are. They're much more acclimated to whatever environmental conditions we get at whatever time of year. If we're thinking about warm season food plots, with very few exceptions, all these food plot plantings that we plant in the warm season are not native to the southeastern U.S., with the really only exception is American joint vetch. Mm-hmm. And those species that we plant, whether it's soybean or cowpea or whatever, I mean, some of them have decent drought resistance and they've got a deep root system, but most of them, by the time we get to, this time of year, July, August, September, they're starting to feel the effects of heat and drought, and they're not doing as hot. But then go into your woods where plants have been evolving in this system for eons, and those plants are still luscious and green. And if you just observe what deer are eating and when they're eating it, you will often notice that they are in those maintained, managed, early successional plant communities heavily this time of year, despite there being food plots available. So I just say that to say that even if you have a really well-managed food plot program, that is certainly not the only thing that deer need and the only thing they're using.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you hit a bunch of good points there. But one thing that I'll reiterate is I get calls every year. Say, for example, in the fall, I get calls and people say that, hey, the deer aren't coming to my food plots. Well, my first question is, did you have a pretty good acorn crop? You know what I mean? So and what I'm getting at is we're not competing with Mother Nature with food plots, with supplemental food plots. The plant community that has evolved to grow in those areas, if you facilitate the growth of that is what the deer have evolved to eat. They're going to choose that over your food plot plantings just about every single time. So that's a good point. It's another reason why manage the habitat, promote the native seed stock, and then again, the supplemental food plots are there if you need them. So great points, Luke.
Yeah, again, the emphasis on supplemental, right? I mean, They're there when the deer need them, but there's also going to be other things that they're going to eat.
Yeah, and I often talk about, they're going to choose the native seed stock first, right? That's what they're going to choose, what's evolved to grow there. But Luke, you brought up a good point with those native plants. They're more drought tolerant. They're more hardy. They're used to the conditions that they grow in, and that's why they have evolved to be here. So that's a good point too. That's another reason why you should strive to make sure you're reaching the potential habitat management wise on your property.
Yeah. One more point I want to add there. Think about the economic returns of managing your woods and your fields versus food plots. I can manage hundreds of acres of timber or old fields for the cost of managing a single acre of food plots. Yeah. Drip torch fuel is extremely cheap, and one squirt bottle of herbicide, it goes a really long way. And I mean, the cost of planting a food plot on a per acre per year basis is going to be $100 to $300 or $400 depending on soil amendment needs. You can buy a bunch of drip torch fuel and a bunch of herbicide for that cost and make way more deer food, not on a per acre basis necessarily. Food plots are generally going to outperform your woods or your fields on a per acre basis. But
Yeah.
when you can put 100 acres of well-managed timber or old field on the ground for the cost of a single acre food plots, that's where your money's best spent.
Yeah, 100%. And I preach that a lot too. I mean, the seed stock, again, it's there. It's all about managing the competition, getting that stuff out of the way, and then disturbing that soil, getting that native seed stock to grow. I often refer to it as your natural food plot versus your supplemental food plot, right? It's there, promote it. But not to get away from our topic today, I absolutely love cool season food plots. We all do. I love the process. I think it's, tractor therapy for me, playing around with mixes, all that good stuff. Absolutely love it. But we like to mention first and foremost that make sure you're checking the boxes with your habitat management. Then we come in with the cool season food plots, which is what we're talking today. So the first thing I want to ask y'all is why plant food plots?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good answers to that very question. I think if you're talking about cool season specifically, I mean, really, traditionally you think about cool season food plots being something to help you hunt, right?
Mhm.
Giving you an opportunity to go target a food source that you know animals are going to come into and have an opportunity to harvest an animal. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that comes to mind when we start thinking about cool season food plots.
Yeah, that's probably number one. But I do work with landowners. They're like, look, I just want to see more deer. I'm not necessarily interested in checking the boxes or reaching my harvest management goals. We all know that people aren't shooting enough deer in many areas. But there are a lot of people that say, look, I want to take my kids. I want to take my camera, whatever it may be. I just want to increase the number of critters that I'm looking at when I'm sitting out in my shooting house or something like that. So that's one thing that I do like to bring up is it's not just about harvest opportunities. If you increase the number of critters that you see, and that's deer, turkeys, that's whatever else. And then Luke, you mentioned earlier, especially this is when we get into the size of the food plot being important, we can actually increase the nutrition that we're providing, especially when they need it.
Yeah, so I guess I would kind of tackle that from a couple different perspectives. One, so we already talked about the observation. We observe more critters in food plots. It helps us hunt critters more effectively. But the other side of the coin is addressing nutritional limitations. And when we're thinking about addressing nutritional limitations, the first thing we need to think about is what time of year is most nutritionally stressful or most nutritionally demanding for deer in this case. And in the deep south, that's going to be mid to late summer when does are lactating and bucks are finishing up antler growth, and simultaneous with that, plant quality on the landscape is beginning to decline. So mid to late summer is the most nutritionally demanding period in the deep south, with a secondary nutritional stress period of mid to late winter. But our winters in the deep south are not that severe. Go up to Minnesota, and Dr. Mitchell, you can speak to this more, but you kind of flip-flop that when you go up to Minnesota, where now our most nutritionally demanding period is no longer mid to late summer. It's actually mid to late winter to maybe even really early spring. So if our focus is addressing a nutritional bottleneck, think about what the most nutritionally demanding time of year is.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable how severe those winters get up in the upper north or upper Midwest. Excuse me. I mean, we had, even in southern Minnesota, we had a couple of winters, and even in South Dakota when I was there, the snowpack was so deep that you could see browse lines way above trees where you would normally not see them. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. Not only are deer trying to battle just a lack of food on the landscape, they've also got to paw through feet of snow to get anything on the ground. I mean, there's just a lot of different things to consider for winter severity when you get up to that part of the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different world, one that I don't have a lot of experience with. But yeah, you think most hunters, I would guess down here in the South at least, are planting food plots to get deer in front of them. Right. Call them kill plots, harvest plots, whatever you'd like. Most of them are planted in smaller areas, and they're just trying to get a deer to walk by them during the daylight so they could, take a shot. But nothing wrong with any of those reasons. And for example, I mentioned earlier, it's like therapy for me. So, hey, maybe I just want to plant food plots. I want to grow something and, reap the rewards of that. So whatever it may be, lots of different reasons to plant food plots, whether you're trying to increase nutrition that late winter, you've got bucks trying to recuperate from the rut, whatever it may be. Lots of different reasons to do it though. And as we're getting into that, talking about nutrition, we're talking about food plots from a perspective of, okay, drawing deer in, or from a nutritional standpoint. I work with a lot of landowners that don't really understand necessarily the nutritional requirements of a white-tailed deer. you've got herbivores, you've got ruminants, which is the classification of whitetail and things like cattle. But even within that ruminant category, it's not all equal, right? So you've got something like a cow that can eat tons and tons of grass, rake it all in, and then sit there in the shade and break that stuff down. Well, whitetail don't have the luxury of being able to break down that really tough, fibrous plant material. So they're restricted to consuming mostly very high quality, easy to digest plants, right? And that's what they need. So you're talking about an animal that's got to be very picky just because of the way that their body works, their size of their gut compared to their body, their metabolic rate. It just requires something that's going to come in, be broken down very quickly, and give them the nutrients and the energy that they need. So that's one more reason why these food plots can be beneficial, right? We're planting very high quality, nutritious forages, and these animals require them to thrive.
Yeah. It's it's funny because it's a really, really good point. If you think about just put a deer right next to a cow and you just think about just the sheer difference in size between those two animals, right? And the rumen being so much bigger, a cow can just take in so much more low quality food because they have a lot more time where that food's going to be in the rumen digesting. They have a much slower passage rate through the digestive system. So there's a lot more time for nutrients to be absorbed out of that low quality food. And really, you think about it, they're maximizing a low quality food stuff, right? Whereas in contrast, in comparison, whitetail deer, much smaller rumen, much faster passage time. They just simply aren't built the same way. They cannot digest low quality food the same way that a cow can. So if they're going to survive, persist, and maximize their antler size and their body size, they've got to have access to that high quality stuff.
Yeah, and to just take that a little bit further, they have high quality diet requirements, but they also eat a mixed diet. They've been documented to eat 400, 500, 600 different plant species. And so it's not just one. So one thing that we can do with these cool season food plots, we add more variety. I think about it like going to the buffet, right? If we all go to Golden Corral, I guarantee you we can find something. Now, I ain't gonna eat a little bit of everything, but I guarantee you everybody there is going to find something that they like. So it's what this deer management thing comes down to, whether it's habitat or food plots. We provide the options. They know what they need. They'll make the right decisions. So anyways, just some of that on the nutrition. Let's get back to building a food plot. We're starting to talk now about food size and placement. We've talked on food plot size and placement. Luke, Eric, any input on that?
I can start and then y'all can chime in where you see fit. So I think in terms of food plot size, there is no golden rule or rule of thumb other than making sure that there is enough food in your food plot to outgrow deer grazing pressure and suppress weeds. That is the number, and we'll get into more of the herbicide management and weed control later, but one of the most important considerations when you are developing a food plot program is to make sure that your planted species are outgrowing competition and outgrowing deer grazing pressure. Let's think about a very easy example here. If we plant soybeans in a 2-acre food plot, those soybeans are going to germinate very quickly, and the first leaves that pop up are going to be the cotyledons of those soybeans. And in a 1-acre food plot, even sometimes sub 5 acres. I've seen this in 5-acre food plots before. I've even seen this in 10-acre food plots with really high deer densities. Those soybeans will all germinate, and then deer will come in and nip off those very young soybean plants below their youngest leaves, and those soybean plants are now dead. And now what colonizes that growing space? Weeds. Something is going to occupy the growing space in a food plot. It's either going to be the species you plant, or it's going to be things that you didn't plant. So when we're, and soybeans is an easy example there. There are other forages that establish very quickly and are very grazing tolerant, but it's very important when we're thinking about food plot size that we consider what we're planting, the other forage that's available on the landscape that can buffer grazing pressure in your food plots. And it's important that we think about the timing that deer are consuming those forages to let them establish and outcompete weeds. In terms of food plot size, and I guess the other aspect of food plot size that I'll touch on, or maybe food plot shape might be a better way to frame this. So if you think about the most efficient shape of a food plot in terms of maximizing surface area to perimeter, that's going to be a circle. People aren't usually planting circular food plots because it's very difficult to, get implements in and plant in a straight line with a circle. So oftentimes what that's going to end up being is a square. A square is a very efficient food plot shape in terms of maximizing the amount of surface area in your food plot and minimizing the amount of perimeter. Now, why is that important? Because if you think about a food plot's shape relative to the surrounding vegetation, there are big implications for competition. So let's think about planting a long, skinny food plot, let's say on a power line right away, or a pipeline right away, or along a road in the summertime that's surrounded by hardwood trees. We see that very commonly. Hardwood trees have a broad, fibrous root system that is relatively shallow compared to a pine tree. So when we plant, warm season plantings, when hardwood trees are actively growing and actively pulling nutrients and water out of the soil, those food plots perform much more poorly than they would if planted adjacent to pine trees. What happens when you see a big windstorm come through and blow through a mixed stand of hardwoods and pine trees? Let's say a tornado. Oftentimes the hardwoods get uprooted and you see the whole root ball tip up over, but the pine trees snap off halfway up the tree. It's because pine trees have a very deep taproot, a very deep root system, and so they are oftentimes pulling nutrients from deeper into the soil, whereas a hardwood's root system is branching out. That root system that branches out and is very shallow, relatively speaking, is competing with your food plot. So if I got a blank slate of a property and I'm trying to decide where I'm going to put a warm season food plot versus a cool season food plot, I'm always going to try to maximize the surface area relative to perimeter, let's say, and try to plant larger squares or big rectangles, nothing really long and skinny. But if it's got to be long and skinny, I'm going to want that to be planted adjacent to pines, especially if it's a warm season food plot.
Yeah.
And then there are lots of other considerations as far as, soil quality and things like that. I guess I'll touch on that very briefly. And I'm stealing this from our friend and colleague, John Grucci with MDWF&P. He has I think, a very good working philosophy of how to structure and lay out food plots relative to soil fertility. So if we're thinking about perennial food, let's start with warm season annual food plots. So in much of the mid-South to deep South, I'd say from, Tennessee and Virginia further south, it generally is very dry in the mid to late summer. So if we are planting or planning or laying out a warm season food plot, it is best to put those warm season food plots in lower lying areas that are not going to be as moisture limited. Because warm season annual food plots are going to be the most productive in terms of pounds per acre planting that you're going to plant on your property. And in those low-lying areas, they're not going to be as moisture limited as upland areas. If you tried to plant a soybean or cowpea food plot on a ridge top where it's getting a lot more full sun and the soil is drained a lot more and it doesn't hold as much moisture, that food plot is not going to perform as well as it would in a lower lying area. And then for cool season food plots, if you're planting, crimson clover and a cereal grain, it just so happens that a lot of those cool season species perform better on higher, drier sites. And the added benefit is, during the winter time, we get a lot of precipitation from November to February, March. It is raining a lot in Mississippi. So moisture isn't as big of a limitation. And then perennial food plots, you're going to go somewhere intermediate, some kind of a loamy soil where it's not super low lying. And you're not going to have a lot of weed competition as you might in an annual food plot. And you're not going to plant it on a dry ridge top that's just going to get smoked as soon as, the early summer comes in. So that's just a few different considerations as far as size, the neighboring plant community, whether it's hardwoods or pine trees, the shape of your food plot, and then location on your property.
Yeah, I mean, you hit a lot of really good points. And, starting broad, like you mentioned, plant the plants that are going to be able to survive, right? We always use, and soybeans are a warm season example, but we always use those. We know that they're an ice cream plant. We know that deer are going to hammer them. And that's a good point. It may be, we know it's an ice cream plant, man, that sounds attractive. But if you are not harvesting enough deer, if you are not keeping your deer density where it needs to be, if you're not managing your habitat to provide other food sources, they're going to destroy that food plot before you ever even see any productivity out of it. I've actually went with landowners that did not have exclosure cages, which we'll mention later, and you can step away for a few weeks, and when you come back, it looks like you had a food plot failure. Well, you didn't. They just ate it to the dirt. And then it's going to colonize by weeds, and you're just going to have a headache, and you're not going to get the value out of all of the effort that you put into it. So yeah, from a broad perspective, absolutely gotta look at your placement, at the number of acres you're planting, the plot forage that you're planting, all of that good stuff. And then there's other things to consider that you touched on too. A lot of it, we like to think about, okay, well, what plant can I plant that's going to just give me the most productivity in the shade? Well, not many of them. They all require sunlight. They all require water. They all require nutrients. Every single one of them. They got to have those things. Of course, there's some, and we'll talk about this later, that are more tolerant to shade or more tolerant to, droughty conditions, whatever it may be. But these are some of your really basic things to think about. And I'm guilty of it. I've planted food plots in an area that flooded the entire fall, and I didn't have any success out of it. You learn the hard way, right? But you can also take advantage of those, like you said. Plant some of those in the lowland areas that are going to hold a little more moisture. Give yourself, better chances of success. And I think it's also important to think about these things when you get ready to plant. Okay, well, that's the situation or the environment, the condition that we're planting in. What's that going to look like in the fall? What's that area going to look like when it starts to rain in the fall, in the winter, that kind of thing. So you got to think about what it's going to look like later. Is it going to be conducive to growing a successful food plot?
Yeah, those are all really, really good considerations. I think we could probably even take it back one step further and just talk about soil. Why are those so important? How do they facilitate progress throughout the rest of the season after you grow and things like that?
Yeah, and we're going to get into that here shortly, for sure, because that is one of the most important things to ensure that you are setting yourself up for success. But before we jump into that, what about things like woods roads or old logging roads? There's so many different areas that you could take advantage of to plant that doesn't require a lot of the heavy lifting of maybe clearing an area or anything like that. Luke, I've noticed out at, Longview, you've got food plots running up and down the roads and everywhere. You've taken advantage of every area we have out there.
Yeah, I'll go back to our very introductory topic on this thing, and I am going to, I'd say 9 times out of 10, I'm going to prefer to manage my roadsides with fire relative to food plots, just because, you can, let's take a very easy example here. You could plant crimson clover and wheat successfully along a woods road or a food plot, and they will grow, but the vast majority of the time, and we didn't even get into orientation of food plots, east, west versus north, south. And that's
sunlight.
That's a whole other topic. But, most food plot plantings require at least 3 to 4 hours of direct sunlight every day. And most of them are going to be more in that 4 to 6 to 8 range of direct sunlight. They're going to perform best with that much sunlight. So if you're planting, let's say, a road that's running east and west, think about the sun's orientation throughout the day. It is always at a southerly aspect because we're in the northern hemisphere. So if you're planting a woods road that's only 10, 20, 30, 40 yards wide even, that's running east and west, it is going to get very little direct sunlight throughout the day. Minimal, if any. But if you're planting a woods road that's running north and south, now in the morning, it's not getting any direct sunlight, but midday from, let's say, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., it's getting direct sunlight. So if I am going to plant a woods road or long, narrow food plot on a pipeline or something, I'm usually going to lean towards those north-south food plots just because they'll get a little bit more sunlight. But to go back to your original question, I think if you compare, let's say, a crimson clover and wheat planting along your woods roads versus a crimson clover and wheat planting in a large 5-acre food plot, you will have a successful establishment of crimson and wheat in both areas, but you will notice that your crimson clover and wheat will probably be a quarter to half as tall on your woods road as they will in the food plot. And that's just a sunlight limitation. There, are some other soil nutrient things, but, assuming soil nutrients are equal among those two areas, your plantings are going to be much less productive when they get less sunlight. So I say all of that to say that, yes, you can certainly effectively do it. Certain plantings are better for low sunlight conditions than others. But if I am going to do it, I'm going to try to plant them in areas that are north-south oriented and will get more sunlight, maybe, and if you're in hardwoods, they're going to get a lot of sunlight in the wintertime. So you could plant those either east, west, or north, south. But my preference for those areas always is going to be maintainable with fire.
Yep. No, and I 100% agree with you on that. We've got perfect example at at Longview down the road where we got all these planted. We've got, 25, 30-year-old pines, and they're all running east to west. Our plots are, and you walk in them in any time, and they're just not getting the sunlight that they need in some of those areas. And there's not much you can do about that either, aside from do like you mentioned, mow the native seed stock. But if you do want to plant woods, roads, that kind of thing, I'm all for it. Just consider the amount of sunlight that you're getting. We'll get into soil tests because Eric mentioned that, and that is probably the most crucial part of all this here in a minute. But yeah, crimson and wheat's a good one that I recommend. Another one, I'll go perennial, maybe Ladino or Durana clover with wheat. And especially, if these are roads that you're going to be driving down with a four-wheeler and muddying it up every week, probably not going to have a successful food plot. Just some other things to consider there. And that kind of brings us to also talking about other constraints that we may have. So equipment, this is one thing that I talk quite a bit about with people, because people are maybe interested in getting into food plots, planting food plots, or even doing habitat management improvement we talk about, but they feel like they've got to have the brand new John Deere tractor, or they got to have, the best of the best equipment. And that's just not the case. And Luke, y'all have done we've done some really good stuff at Mississippi State where we've shown that you can get by with minimal equipment and still get some really good turnout for your food plots.
Yeah, there is a saying among food plotters: it's not the equipment, it's the operator. And that is absolutely true. You can plant, it's going to take some more work, and you got to be a little more careful about exactly how you do things, but you can plant just as good of a food plot with a backpack sprayer and a hand seeder as you can with a 10-foot disc and a 20-foot boom sprayer and a no-till drill.
The three of us literally did that at the beginning of summer for our warm season food plots. We planted sunflowers and cowpeas with exactly what you just mentioned. So, we're still doing it. Sometimes it's just easier. I've even planted food plots. My uncle has a horse-drawn disc, and so two big draft horses pulling a disc. I've planted food plots that way, so you can make it happen. I'm not saying that's probably more expensive equipment than the big tractor, but you can do it many different ways. And I still, unless I'm just planting big acres, I'm all for grabbing a little hand seeder and running out there. There's so much control to it. It's just easy. It's simple. And then, of course, some of the other considerations, you got to think about access. We're hunters, right? So, all of this, and I don't think it's come up yet, but all of this, you need to start thinking about, are you going to be able to access this food plot without scaring every deer you've got off your property? Different things like that, Plant existing openings, plant wood roads, plant food plots where the deer want to be. There's some simple considerations there. And then, of course, I think we're all constrained to some extent by finances, but there's cheap ways to do this. So, Eric?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. There's really two aspects when you start thinking about food plots. You have generating the plot itself, the nutritional value, getting a successful food plot to grow, but then orientation for hunting. That's something that a lot of people will emphasize too. And both aspects need a lot of consideration.
Wind, cover, all that good stuff. And then also, if you start thinking giant food plots with no cover out in the middle, or no cover when you're approaching getting into the food plot, different things like that, there's ways to get around that too. There's things we can plan or promote that are going to create maybe a little softer entrance into that food plot, have deer moving a little easier through theirs.
Well, I think a lot of that comes back to the original objectives of whoever's planning that food plot, right? Do you want to see a lot of deer, the observability aspect of it? Are you going to be hunting it? Are you hunting it with your bow, or are you hunting it with your rifle? That's going to come into play a lot with how you're designing that food plot. If you need a closer shot, if you can reach out and touch them a little bit further, all that stuff needs to be considered when you're thinking about food plot design.
Percent. Eric, bring us into soil samples.
Yeah. So soil samples, one of probably the first thing you should be doing when you're thinking about planting a food plot. Soil samples are so beneficial because I don't think a lot of people realize how much money they waste on things like fertilizer without actually taking a soil sample. It's going to tell you what's limiting in that soil and what you need to add to it to maximize the potential to actually get that food plot to be successful.
Yeah. And a big thing is, to your point, a lot of people don't realize that you may have all the nutrients that you need, but if that pH is not right, which we often deal with low pHs here, right? pH level of 5.5, that's not uncommon. It's actually really common. But you could have something, for example, phosphorus will be tied up. It's formed this bond with aluminum. So now phosphorus is not available to the plants. There's lots of different examples of like this, where these nutrients have become tied up in the dirt, in the soil, and the plants don't have access to them. So the nutrients may be there. And of course, everybody's going to dump fertilizer out, whether they need it or not, and too much of a good thing is not a good thing. But you may be dumping fertilizer out on the ground, but if that pH is not where it needs to be, the plant can't uptake the nutrients. I feel like we harp on the soil test a lot, but they're $10 here at MSU. Go out, collect a few samples across your field, put them in a bucket, mix them up, put them in a Ziploc, send them to us, and the soil lab will print off everything you need to know about the dirt, how you can amend the soil to make sure that you got the best chances of having a productive food plot.
It's worth harping on because it's a fundamental, right? Think about sports analogies. You've got to get the fundamentals down before you can advance. Same thing with food plots. It's a fundamental thing. It's a very easy, cheap thing to do that's going to help ensure the success of that food plot. So, I mean, it's absolutely worth doing. It's essential.
Don't shoot yourself in the foot. This is the basic thing. And you can collect it anytime, after turkey season or while you're out there chasing turkeys. Go ahead and collect some soil samples. It's not difficult.
Yeah.
Luke, how many soil samples do you think you've collected over the years? 2 or 3?
I've collected, hold on, I need a calculator for this. I mean, I've pulled thousands of soil cores over the last couple of years. Easily thousands, sent off hundreds of soil samples. A lot.
And you can do this with a shovel. You could do this with a core sampler. You could do this. I used to have an auger bit that was like a foot long. I'd put on the end of the drill. So when the dirt was really tough and it's hard to get a shovel in there, you could drill down there and it brings up that core, throw it in the bucket. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to do it, but it's simple. I submitted 9 soil samples about a month ago to the lab here. Within a week, I had the readouts. I knew exactly how much lime I needed. I knew exactly how much NP and K that I needed to make sure that whatever I planted was going to grow successfully. Yeah. If everything else works out, right? It's got to rain, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it can't rain too much.
And I've actually back in, I guess it was 16 and 17 for my master's research, I planted 290 food plots in the state of Mississippi, both years. Well, one year we planted, perfect timing, didn't get rain until like November. It was terrible year. November. And then the following year we were ready to go. And then we couldn't get a tractor in any of our fields until about November. So you just never know what you're going to be dealing with. So anyways, one thing you can deal with is amending the soil. Take your soil samples, send those in, they're cheap, and make sure you're not, shooting yourself in the foot before you ever even get seed in the ground.
Yeah. Well, I'll spend a little bit more time on soil samples just because they are fundamental and very important. You mentioned a minute ago how much fertilizer you waste based on where your pH is at. And this is going to vary for every soil nutrient, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, potassium, whatever. They're all a little bit different. But in general, if you have a soil pH of 4.5, you're wasting about 70% of your fertilizer. If your soil pH is 5.0, which is not uncommon in the deep south, you're wasting about 50% of your fertilizer. Mm-hmm. Lime is the absolute cheapest soil amendment there is. Now, oftentimes you need to apply tons of it per acre, but it's still very cheap. So yeah, number one, a lot of times people will be like, oh, well, I can't do lime and fertilizer, so which one would I do? The best answer is do both of them. Soil amendments are not that expensive, especially relative to a poor productivity food plot when you don't amend your soil. But if I could only do one, I'm going to do lime because there are nutrients in your soil that are just not available to plants if your pH is off. Yeah. So A, do a soil test. B, amend according to that soil test recommendations. Now let's talk about timing of soil tests and timing of soil amendments a little bit. So everyone's kind of got their own way of doing this, but the way that I prefer to time my soil samples relative to my amendments and my plantings, I like to take soil samples. Let's say I'm planting a cool season food plot. Okay. So I'm going to plant it in September, October. I like to pull my soil samples in March because March represents the end of that fall growing season. And March should represent the soil nutrient profile in March should represent what is most limiting to those plants at the end of their growth cycle. So what have those plants pulled out of the soil all growing season, and now what is limiting? So if you pulled your soil test in September, a week or two before you plant, there are probably nutrients in the soil profile that those plants are going to extract and use throughout the fall that might end up being limiting by the time you get to January or February when those plants are really starting to put on growth. So I like to, sample at the end of whatever planting season I'm talking about. So if I'm planting a warm season food plot, I like to sample in August or September. Cool season food plot, I like to sample in, February, March, April, sometime in that time frame. I guess, do we want to talk about timing of soil amendments, or do we not want to get into all that?
Yeah, we'll get into that for sure. No, I appreciate your insight on that. I think, if you're getting down to the true details, there are so many different things that you can do, a calendar of events, if you will. And we should, I think as deer hunters, we all have a calendar of events in the back of our mind. But yeah, there's some ideal times to do these things. One thing I will say is, if you can't do them at the ideal time, still do them. Collect them at any point. We're going to talk amending soils here in a minute. And when we're talking about putting lime out, it's not an instant fix. It takes time to do these things. And with lime, it's one of those things that you do as soon as possible. And then you can fertilize when you plant, so there's different ways to go about that. But yeah, let's start talking about, I wouldn't mind even chatting about the difference in like your ag lime or your pelletized lime, different things like that. I know that we've all worked with that a little bit too. I think it's a common question. So anybody want to dive into that?
Yeah, I guess I can. So I almost exclusively use pelletized lime for most of my stuff. And the reason for that, pelletized lime is more expensive than ag lime. So for people who don't know, pelletized lime is essentially just you take ag lime and put it in a pellet form. Yeah. It's got a binding agent in it and it looks like a fish feed pellet. And it's the thing about that process is, one, it takes more manufacturing and processing, so it's more expensive, but it is much easier to apply. I can apply pelletized lime with the cyclone spreader on the back of the tractor or, any number of different implements. But ag lime, you need a specialized spread. You need either a drop spreader or a specialized lime buggy to spread that ag lime, just because it gets real cakey and powdery and it's very difficult, if not possible, to spread with most planting equipment.
Yeah. Most of the time you're going to get the co-op truck to come out, or you're going to rent their lime buggy. That's at least what I've done in the past. Sure. And like you said, it's kind of like the pellet grills. That's just wood that's been, compressed into a pellet. Same idea. It's the same ag lime. It's just in a pellet form, which, as you said, means that you can spread it in many different ways. Yeah. What are your thoughts on it being a little slower to react because it's in that pelletized form versus that powdery substance?
Yeah, there are a number of different, everyone's got an opinion on this. Some people say that you need to use 10 times the amount of pelletized lime as like a 10-to-1 ratio relative to ag lime because it's slower to react and it's not as efficient. That is just not true. Back when in the, I don't even know, 80s or whenever pelletized lime really became a thing, pelletized lime was a byproduct of limestone operations when they're processing limestone. Now, because there is such a demand for pelletized lime in the agriculture food plot space, lawn space is a big one. A lot of, lawn landscapers use pelletized lime. Now, pelletized lime is essentially just ag lime that is pelletized. It's not a different product. It's the same product. So the fineness and the liming value of pelletized lime, for all intents and purposes, is identical to ag lime. So, in terms of timeline, it might be a little bit slower to react with the soil and adjust pH than ag lime is. But, for all intents and purposes, I'm not going to apply it sooner than ag lime. It is going to adjust your soil pH at the same time as ag lime is.
Well, and like we said, this process takes time. You don't dump it out and immediately see a change in the pH. Ideally, if you could apply your lime amendments a year in advance, is when you're really going to start to see some true changes there. That's why we say, if you can, collect these soil samples and see what that pH is and amend it immediately, that's the best plan of action. What about liquid lime? I've never used liquid lime. Have you ever used liquid lime?
I have used liquid lime, and I am not a fan of liquid lime.
Yeah. That's why I haven't used it. I've never used it, so I don't have much of an opinion on it, but just looking at it, some of the things I've read about it, works faster, much more expensive. The effects I hear don't last nearly as long.
Well, that is true, and I think while we're on the liquid lime subject, it's worth spending a little bit of time on this. So think about your typical lime application. Let's say your soil pH is 5.0. Oftentimes, for most food plot plantings, you want your soil pH to be at least 6.0. Oftentimes, the goal is 6.5. So if you're sitting at a 5 or 5.5, it depends on, I don't want to get too much into soil chemistry here, but it depends a lot on your CEC and your buffer capacity of your soil. If you have a heavy clay soils have higher CECs, and higher CECs, which is cation exchange capacity, mean you have a higher buffer capacity. Your soil's buffer capacity is its ability to resist changes in pH. So if you have a heavy clay soil, it is going to resist changes in pH more than a sandy soil. So if I've got, let's say, a clay soil pH 5.5 and a sandy soil pH 5.5, I might need 3 tons per acre of lime or even more to get my pH up to 6.5 in my clay soil, but I might only need 1 or 2 tons of lime per acre in my sandy soil because the buffer capacity in your sandy soil is less. So I know it's got a lot of different rabbit trails I'm about to get off on here. I'm going to pick one and go with it, and then we'll get back to the original question. This goes back to planning the location of your food plots. I am always going to put my food plots in locations where my soil fertility is the highest on my property. I'm going to relegate the areas of the poorest soil fertility to my old field management for a couple reasons. One, the more productive a site is, the more often you are going to need to disturb that site either with fire or disking to maintain the desired species composition and structure. If I put an old field in a bottomland system with a lot of soil moisture, you are going to need to burn that thing every year or two to prevent it from being a forest within a couple of years. And oftentimes you might not even get to burn it because it's going to be so wet. So I'm not putting an old field in a bottom surrounded by tulip poplars and cottonwoods and, these species that seed, and sweet gums that seed rapidly and do really well in wet productive sites. I'm going to allocate that to my warm season food plot. So I just got off on I'm going all sorts of directions.
No, that's good stuff.
Oh yeah.
So liquid lime. Okay. So liquid lime and liquid fertilizer. I am a big believer that the only some exceptions here potentially, but the only real application for liquid fertilizer is with micronutrients. The main reason for that is because if you think about needing tons per acre of lime and maybe, 150 to up to 300 or 400 pounds per acre of NP or K, depending on which nutrient it is, you are not getting 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium into solution to spray it.
Yeah.
Okay. You would have to literally spray hundreds of gallons per acre in your food plot to get enough of that nutrient to stay into solution in your sprayer to get it on your food plot. It's just not going to happen. It's not efficient. It's much more efficient to go to the co-op and buy a couple 50-pound bags of, urea or triple superphosphate or whatever and just spread it with a spreader. It's so much more efficient, let alone trying to get 1,000 pounds of lime, 2,000, 4,000 pounds of lime into solution. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
I mean, adjusting your soil pH is chemistry. You are literally displaced. I'm not even going down that rabbit hole. But bottom line, you need to chemically change the acidity profile in your soil, and that's just a math problem. You need so much neutralizing agent to do that, and you cannot get enough neutralizing agent into solution to make a spray solution of liquid lime effective. Same thing with primary and secondary nutrients in most cases. The only time that I would potentially recommend a foliar or a liquid fertilizer application is with micronutrients, because micronutrients are needed by the plants in micro doses. That's why they're called micronutrients. Plants need very little of them. So you can get enough micronutrients into solution to apply on your food plots. But let's think about that for a minute. Micronutrients are very rarely limiting to food plot production. And number two, if your pH is in the range where it's supposed to be, with very few exceptions, your micronutrients are also going to be available at the proper rates to your plants. You're rarely needing to amend your micronutrients. There are some cases with like alfalfa is one example where you might need to amend some micronutrients. But most of the time, if your pH is where it's supposed to be in that 6 to 7 range, your micronutrient availability is just fine.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I've never dealt with that. It's not been an issue that I've had. I mean, the things that we commonly use, they work. They work for a reason, right? So when you're talking pH, you've got to redirect. It's a numbers game, like you said. We're just redirecting the ship to where it needs to be. That's the pH to make sure that the nutrients that you likely have are attainable by the plant. And then, of course, we come in with fertilizers to make sure that we've got the nutrients that we need. And it's not necessarily something that you have to do every single year. It's just I do collect my soil samples every year because I'm interested in the data, right? I'd like to see how it's changed, that kind of stuff. But yeah, so lime, ag lime. And also we should mention, if you're interested in this, anything we're talking about today, we've got all sorts of publications and stuff that'll help explain this a little bit better. You can also reach out to us, but your co-op, this is where you're likely going to buy your seed. They're going to have your lime. They're going to be able to educate you a little bit on those different factors as well. Yeah.
I guess one more point on the lime thing before we move on. So primary nutrients in your soil, most soil tests are going to recommend amending based on primary and secondary nutrients in your soil, whichever of those are most limiting for whatever you want to plant. So your primary nutrients are your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Your secondary nutrients is calcium, magnesium, sulfur. So lime applications are broken down, generally speaking. There are a few exceptions here, but the vast majority of lime products that you're going to be able to go to your local feed and seed store, your local co-op and get are either going to be calcitic lime or dolomitic lime. Dolomitic lime is magnesium based, and it will provide magnesium and calcium to your soil. Oftentimes, if you need a lime application and your soil test also calls for magnesium or calcium, you can use your lime application and exceed the magnesium or calcium requirements. So you don't need to add any additional magnesium or calcium fertilizer. If I submit my soil sample and it says I need to add, 50, 60, 100 pounds per acre of magnesium, I am just going to go get dolomitic lime when I buy my liming product, and that way I will get plenty of magnesium when I add my lime. If you don't need magnesium, if your soil test indicates you don't need any magnesium, but you need calcium, another secondary nutrient, you can either use dolomitic or calcitic lime because they both contain calcium.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. That's a great point. Where we keep harping on the soil pH, but lime also, it does other things like you just mentioned. It's got some of those nutrients in it. It can improve the soil microbial activity, improves the nitrogen fixation by legumes, soil structure. I mean, there's a lot of different things that there's benefits to it. And we just typically go based off of that soil sample recommendation on trying to improve the plant's uptake of the nutrients. But that's a good point, Luke. All right. Here's a curveball I'll throw. So I know that some of our friends in the Western U.S., they may deal with, instead of acidic soils, they have the alkaline soils. Have you ever dealt with that, either one of you?
Yes, but not to the point that it's really problematic. I mean, if the most alkaline soil that we are going to have, as far as I'm aware, in our part of the world is going to be something in the Black Prairie soil region. Yeah. Oftentimes in the Black Prairie, you're going to have soil pH in the 8s. 8 is because, soil pH goes from 1 to 14. Anything below 7 or really below 6 is acidic, and anything above 7 or 8 is basic. And that 7 range is neutral. And we're generally trying to get pH to a neutral range because that's where other nutrients are most available. If your soil does become too basic, so in the 8 to 9 range or certainly higher, it can do the exact same thing or a similar thing as what a 4.0 pH would do. And certain nutrients become plant unavailable at pHs that are too high. Like I said, that is very uncommon. Any sulfur, well, not any sulfur source, but most sulfur sources, ammonium sulfate, for example, is a very common nitrogen fertilizer product that also provides some sulfur. Most sulfur products are going to acidify your soil some. So if you do have a pH of 8.5 or 9 and your soil test recommends reducing your pH to a 7, there are various resources you can use, but ammonium sulfate is a decent option for that because that sulfur component of the ammonium sulfate is going to add some acidity to your soil.
Yeah, and I've gotten questions about this. Like I said, it's more typical of the Western U.S. But like you said, it also binds up certain nutrients. Iron is the one that I'm commonly hearing that has a tough time in the alkaline soils. But yeah, adding organic material, the elemental sulfur, the ammonium sulfate, like you mentioned, it does the same thing, right? As the lime that we're referring to, redirecting the ship back to where it needs to be. Because for any of these plants, you're typically looking for a soil pH of 6 to 7, 6.5, something like that. That's going to be that sweet spot to where, regardless of what you're planting, all of the nutrients that are in the soil or that you're going to put in the soil can be uptaken by that plant. Just figured I'd throw that out. And I have gotten a couple of questions about that. And I know we got a lot of listeners out in the West. They may be dealing with something that we don't deal with too often, but we can help. All right. So now that we've talked soil chemistry and deer nutrition and everything else, the important stuff, I should add, what about seedbed preparation? It is time. We've taken our soil samples. We've picked our spots. We know how big they're going to be. Now it's time to get to actually building a food plot, right? We want to start clearing stuff or preparing a seedbed, I should say. What's your go-to, Eric or Luke? What's the first step on your mind?
You got to get a good soil contact with that seed, right? So what are we going to do to actually facilitate that? That's got to be the first point you're thinking about.
Yeah, and a lot of that is just you got to kill the existing vegetation. You got to get that stuff out of the way. If we're talking about your typical practices of sowing, and tilling and that kind of stuff, we're killing that existing vegetation after spraying our herbicides. We typically want to give that a few weeks to react so that you're killing all the way down to the root ball. I can't tell you how many headaches that I've had of root balls pinching in between my disc blades and just stopping up the entire thing because I didn't let those herbicides, have a full effect. What are your thoughts, Luke?
A couple things. One, I'll preface this by saying there are certainly ways to reduce and or eliminate your herbicide use when you're planting food plots. They tend to be a lot more timing specific and timing dependent, and they depend a lot on which species you're planting into. So for example, let's say we're planting more of a no-till food plot and we don't want to use herbicides. You can effectively reduce and in some cases eliminate your herbicide use, but you need to be really careful that the species that you are planting into are going to be dying off or at least not competing at the same time that your new planting is germinating. If you're planting into, let's say we're planting a cool season food plot in September, October, and there's a bunch of weeds in there like Bahia or Dallas grass or Vasey grass or common ragweed or goldenrod or any number of things. Those plants are going to be competing with your emerging food plot, with those young seedlings that you just planted. So unless you get those plants out of the way, you are going to have reduced establishment and germination rates of the species you plant. And that means wasted money. Right now, there are ways to kind of, and this is a whole nother topic, but there are ways to manage in a more of a regenerative context to eliminate some of that herbicide use. But yes, traditionally speaking, when we're managing a food plot based on the conventional textbook, it's going to be spraying a broad spectrum herbicide like glyphosate roughly 3 weeks prior to our tillage. And then that 3-week time frame gives those plants time to die, not only their above ground biomass, but also the below ground biomass, like you mentioned. And we want those root systems to break down. So when we do bring a tiller or a disc or whatever into that food plot, we can create a really fine seed bed. That fine seed bed is very important for seed to soil contact, especially with our smaller seeded species. Some of our larger seeded species, really good seed to soil contact is always important, but it varies some based on which species we're planting. The smaller species, they have very minimal, what we call onboard energy to allocate to new growth, and they need to get a root system down in the ground very quickly to support that new growth coming up. So they need really good seed to soil contact. Now, if you're using no-till, you can plant without tillage into either a burn down seed bed that has all the existing vegetation dead, or you can plant into, green thatch, as long as that green thatch is going to be petering out at the same time as your new plants are coming up. But I guess the other point with seed bed preparation, we can kind of go a couple directions here. If we think about seedbed preparation and our soil amendments, oftentimes we are going to want to incorporate our lime down to at least 2 to 4 inches, if not 6 inches, down into the soil profile so it can neutralize the acidity at the rooting depth of the plants that we're going to plant. Lime does move through the soil, so if you just incorporate it in the top couple inches, or if you just broadcast it onto the top of the soil, it will move down through your soil profile, but it's not going to happen fast, and it's not going to get to the full rooting depth of those plants probably by the time that you need it to get there. So I like to incorporate lime to, at least 4 inches throughout the soil profile. And then when we plant is often when we're going to incorporate our fertilizer. So the tillage process kind of serves a couple of purposes when we're planting our food plot. One, it creates a good rooting environment for our little seedlings and creates really good potential for good seed to soil contact. And it also incorporates our fertilizers. So nitrogen, for example, you could very effectively broadcast your nitrogen on the soil surface and not incorporate it, as long as you get a good rainfall to pull that nitrogen into the soil profile, because nitrogen is very mobile in the soil. It will rapidly move through the soil profile. Phosphorus, on the other hand, is very immobile in the soil. So if you broadcast phosphorus on the soil surface and don't incorporate it, that phosphorus, it'll get pulled, into the top quarter inch or inch of the soil after a few rains, but it is not going to be very mobile in the soil, and it's very unlikely that it will make it all the way down to the rooting depth of whatever plants are in the soil profile. So by incorporating those fertilizers, we make sure that they are at the rooting depth of that plant where they need to be so the plant can access them. Yeah. The other importance of soil texture, and this is mainly for warm season food plots that we're using pre-emergence herbicide applications for, and we'll get into weed management or herbicide applications more when we talk about weed management. But soil texture is very important for pre-emergence herbicide efficacies. When we're spraying, let's say we're planting a deer vetch or a soybean food plot in April or May, and we want to use a pre-emergence herbicide. If we're using conventional tillage, we want really small soil particles, because if the way pre-emergence herbicides work is they get into soil solution, they get into the soil profile, into soil solution, and then when weed seeds germinate, those weed seedlings come into contact with the herbicide in the soil solution, and it kills those weeds before they ever get up and out of the soil, or very soon after they get up and out of the soil. If you've got really large soil clods that are poorly broken down and they're bound tightly together, if you've got poor soil structure, oftentimes that pre-emergence herbicide will get on essentially the perimeter or the outside of that soil clod, but it won't penetrate into the middle of that soil, that big soil particle, that big chunk of, or that big clod of soil. So you'll have weeds that germinate in the middle of that chunk of soil and pop up out of it without ever coming into contact with that pre-emergence herbicide. But if you get a really fine seed bed, and I'm talking like when I'm using conventional tillage and I'm creating a really fine seed bed, I like most of my soil particles to be the size of a marble or smaller. And the largest ones are the size of a golf ball. A lot of times when you go out onto, properties, and they're especially on ones where they're planting a lot of acreage, I get that it's very difficult to get a really fine seed bed on a lot of acres because it takes time, either with a tiller going really slowly or multiple passes with a disc. But often what you'll see is someone, they take 1 or 2, maybe 3 passes over the field with a disc, and most of your soil particles are the size of a softball or a football or a watermelon. I mean, they're huge. Yeah. And, when your soil particles or your clods are that size, it makes it really difficult to get consistent seed to soil contact. And then think about the other thing that happens when you've got soil clods that are the size of, you got a cantaloupe or a watermelon. A lot of times you'll get, when you run your disc through the field, you get these ribbons of soil that kind of peel over. You got this long linear ribbon of soil that's kind of laying on top of the ground. If you go in there and you broadcast your seed, a fair bit of your seed is going to end up below the ridge of that ribbon. And then it rains, and what happens? Your seed is now covered by 3 inches of soil. Yeah. I mean, a little seed, let alone, a soybean's not going to come up through that. And let alone a really small seed that's buried under a couple inches of soil. It's just not going to happen. So you end up with these really variable germination rates and patchy it just ends up being really patchy, and you don't get great results when you don't have really fine soil tech.
Yeah, and we talked about plants need sunlight, they need water, they need nutrients. Well, the nutrients are the soil, right? So you got to have good plant to soil or seed to soil contact. So a lot of times you're going to go in, you're going to spray something like glyphosate, you're going to kill everything there. You're going to give that plenty of time. Like I said, I've run into this many times to where I disc too early. That root ball was not dead. It will hang up in your disc, cause you huge headaches. But once you've given that a few weeks, you'll go in, you'll disc that under. You're going to have what likely a very, very coarse, rough seed bed, like you mentioned, Luke. And if you were to plant on top of that, like you said, you're going to have something like a tiny clover seed that shouldn't be more than a quarter inch under the dirt. It's going to be 3 or 4 inches down. That's not going to work. It's not going to work. Even for your larger seeded plants like wheat, whatever it may be, oats, you don't want them to be any more than about an inch down. So you're losing a lot of seed there. Same thing with your fertilizer, all that good stuff. So a lot of times what it will take is many passes with a disc. If you've got a tiller, great. That really shortens the efforts there. But you're going to continue to go over that. You're going to make sure that it's basically a fine powdery substance. When you step down in it, it's got your footprint in it. That's what I picture when I'm thinking of a good seed bed. All of that seed is going to directly hit that seed bed. There's a little bit of powder there. We could push it under with a cultipacker or, disc it again very lightly. But yeah, that's what's going to make or break a food plot. And another thing to consider there is if you start disking when it's too wet, that is typically when people get those giant dirt clods that are the size of a football, like you mentioned. If it's too wet or if it's too dry, it can also be a problem. So when it comes to the disking and the creating the soil, the seed bed, there's definitely some things to consider there.
You mentioned cultipacking, and a cultipacker is one of my favorite food plot implements.
Yeah.
When I'm planting small seeded species, whether it's, let's say we're warm season, we're planting American joint vetch or Alice clover, or if I'm in the cool season and I'm planting clovers or brassicas or alfalfa or whatever. Oftentimes, if you run your tiller or your disc over that food plot and you get a really nice fine seed bed, like you said, you'll step on it with your boot and your boot will sink down an inch or two. If you broadcast that clover seed or whatever, that small seeded species, and then cultipack only after you plant, and then you get a good rain, oftentimes that rain will settle the soil and you will end up with some seeds that are 1 inch or 2 inches deep and some will be on the soil surface. So when I've got a really fluffy seed bed, and kind of my general rule of thumb is if I step on it, if I make my tillage pass and I'm done disking or tilling, and I step on it and my boot sinks down into that soil more than 1 inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch, I'm going to run a cultipacker over it before I plant, and then I'm going to plant, and then I'm going to run it over it again after I plant to create a really not only fine seed bed, but also a firm seed bed. That firm seed bed is just as, maybe not just as important, but it's a close second to a really fine seed bed.
Yeah, that's an important point too. And I've done, it's not the same, kind of the same idea. I've drug chain link fences behind the 4-wheeler before, to smooth that out, to cover the seed just a little bit. We've all done stuff like that. Chain link fence with a cinder block thrown on it. Those things can work, but a cultipacker is one of my favorites too. It could really help get that seed bed where you want it, and then cover those seeds lightly after you've got your seed bed. And we've got publications too. If you're just curious of what this looks like, a good seed bed, hopefully we've painted the picture, but we've got publications too. But it is one of the most important steps to make sure that, again, you're going to have a successful food plot. All right, guys, I think we've hit it pretty hard already. I think this would be a good stopping point for what we'll call part 1 of this 2-part series here on building a successful food plot. So we appreciate everybody tuning in. Thank y'all. Be on the lookout for the next episode as well. We're going to cover the rest of building a successful food plot. So thank y'all very much. Y'all have a good one.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson family for their endowed financial support. We would not be able to do this without it. We're also grateful to our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service, and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center.
If you have questions or ideas, check out msudeerlab.com and hit the Deer University tab. Thanks for listening.